I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound carried, thinned by the polished oak, but no less sharp for it, finding me where I sat in the shadowed alcove of the upstairs landing, a book lying forgotten in my lap. My mother's voice was a blade wrapped in silk, the tone she used for planning a dinner party or dismissing a servant. There was no difference in it now, as she dissected my life. "Ilara is the problem," she said, and the words were not a lament but a statement of fact, like noting a crack in a teacup. Plain, quiet, and entirely unmarriageable. What are we to do with her when the bailiffs finally come? She will not fetch a price. My father's reply was a low, defeated rumble, the sound of a man who had long ago surrendered the field. "Eleanor, please. She is our daughter. She is our liability," Mother corrected, her voice crisp. "Lavinia now. Lavinia is our salvation. If only the Duke of Blackwood were not such a recluse. They say he has not looked at a woman since his wife died." A pause, a rustle of silk. "But no man is immune to beauty like Lavinia's. We simply need the opportunity." I did not move. I did not breathe. I remained in my alcove, a creature of the shadows, accustomed to being overlooked. It was the truth of my existence. I was the second daughter, the plain one, the one born after the masterpiece. Lavinia was all light and air, her laughter like spun gold, her hair the color of a summer sunset. I was her shadow, composed of muted earth tones, my thoughts, my only vibrant possession. My family saw me as a piece of furniture that occasionally required feeding, and for the most part, I had accepted this role. It afforded me the peace to read, to think, to live within the vast, quiet architecture of my own mind. But hearing the cold calculus of my worthlessness laid bare was a different matter. It was one thing to be ignored. It was another to be priced and found wanting. A liability. The word settled into my bones, a deep and abiding chill that no fire could warm. The opportunity Mother had prayed for arrived a fortnight later in the form of an embossed card. The Duke of Blackwood, whose sprawling Gothic estate bordered our own crumbling property, would be calling, not for any social reason, but on a matter of estate business, a dispute over a shared stream. Yet for my mother, the reason was immaterial. The man himself was coming. The reclusive, fabulously wealthy, and tragically widowed Duke. A prize of such magnitude that the county had been whispering about him for the 5 years since he had buried his young wife and sealed the doors of his life. The house was thrown into a state of managed chaos. Silver was polished until it hurt the eyes, floors were scrubbed, and Lavinia was curated like a museum piece. She was dressed in a gown of pale blue that turned her eyes to sapphires, her hair arranged in a cascade of artful curls. She was breathtaking, a porcelain doll presented on a velvet tray. And my mother stood beside her, the proud artist, her face tight with ambition. I was instructed to make myself scarce. "Stay in the background, Ilara. For heaven's sake, do not draw attention," Mother had commanded, her eyes flicking over my simple gray dress with disdain. I was a smudge on her perfect canvas. I intended to obey. My plan was to become one with the wallpaper in the drawing room, a silent observer to the grand performance. I stood near the heavy damask curtains, the scent of beeswax and desperation thick in the air. Lavinia was seated elegantly on the chaise longue, a book of poetry open on her lap as if she had been caught in a moment of casual intellectualism. It was a book I had been reading the day before. When the butler announced him, the very atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. The Duke of Blackwood was not what I had expected. The whispers had painted him as a haunted, wraith-like figure. But the man who entered was solid, vital, and radiated an intensity that consumed the air. He was tall, dressed in severe black that seemed to absorb the light. His face a collection of harsh, beautiful lines that spoke of grief, yes, but not of weakness. His eyes, a startling, pale gray like a winter sky, swept the room with a cool, assessing glance. My mother surged forward, a symphony of practiced charm. "Your Grace, what an honor! May I present my daughter, Lavinia?" The Duke's gaze rested on my sister for a moment. He gave a slight, formal bow of his head. "Miss Fairchild." His voice was a low baritone, resonant and devoid of warmth. Lavinia, for the first time I could remember, seemed flustered, her practiced smile faltering under the weight of his indifference. He looked at her, but he did not see her. It was the polite, dismissive glance one gives to a pretty painting before moving on to the business at hand. His eyes continued their sweep of the room, and then they found me. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep he had given the furniture, or even my sister. It was a direct, focused, and unnerving look of appraisal. It was as if he had been scanning a page of meaningless script and had suddenly found a word he recognized. I felt the force of it like a physical touch, a sudden, sharp pressure in my chest. I instinctively took a half step back, deeper into the shadows of the curtain, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. My mother, sensing the shift in his attention, moved with the swiftness of a threatened predator. She shifted her position, her voluminous skirts blocking his line of sight to me, a deliberate and unmistakable maneuver. She was a wall between his world and my own. The Duke's gaze did not waver from the spot where I had been. A flicker of something, impatience, perhaps curiosity, crossed his severe features. His voice, when he spoke, cut through my mother's frantic, bubbling chatter. "Madam," he said, his tone still cool but now edged with an undeniable authority. "You are blocking my view." He paused. And in that silence, the entire fragile social artifice of the room collapsed. He looked directly at my mother. Then his eyes flicked to the space behind her. "I asked a question of your daughter," he stated, though he had not. It was a command disguised as a correction. But then he turned his question not to Lavinia, but to my mother herself. He asked with a quiet, deliberate clarity that made the air crackle, "Who is that behind you?" The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and suffocating. My mother's smile froze, a brittle rictus of disbelief and fury. Lavinia stared, her mouth slightly agape. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, the mortifying sensation of being seen when my only wish was to be invisible. For a man who had not looked at a woman in 5 years, he was looking now. And he was not looking at the beautiful, sunlit daughter. He was looking at the shadow. My mother was forced to turn, her movements stiff with rage. "That is merely Alara, Your Grace, my other daughter." The word merely was dropped into the conversation like a stone. He took a step forward, obliging my mother to move aside. He stood before me, and I had to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. Up close, the sorrow in his eyes was more apparent, a settled, ancient thing. But it was alloyed with a keen, unnerving intelligence. He was not looking at my plain dress or my unremarkable face. He was looking at me, at the person behind the facade, with an intensity that felt like a challenge. "Miss Alara Fairchild," he said, and my name on his lips sounded foreign, significant. He gave another small, formal bow, deeper this time than the one he had given my sister. "A pleasure." I could only manage a whisper. "Your Grace?" The business of the stream was dispatched with brisk efficiency. My father, flustered and eager to please, conceded every point. But the Duke's attention seemed divided. His eyes kept returning to me, a quiet, contemplative gaze that I could feel even when I was not looking. When the meeting concluded, he did not take his leave immediately. Instead, he turned to me. "Your sister holds a book of verse, Miss Fairchild. Are you, too, fond of poetry?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that it took me a moment to find my voice. "I prefer prose, Your Grace, and philosophy." A flicker of genuine interest lit his pale eyes. "Indeed? Which philosophers?" "The Stoics, mostly. Marcus Aurelius," I found myself saying, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way," he quoted softly, his eyes fixed on mine. I recognized the passage from his meditations. It was a key turning in a lock I had not known was there. I felt a sudden, shocking kinship with this severe, grieving man. "Yes," I breathed. "That is it exactly." He held my gaze for a moment longer, a silent conversation passing between us that I could not begin to decipher. Then, with another nod, he turned and was gone. The drawing room felt both vast and empty in his absence. My mother's fury, held in check by his presence, erupted. Her words were a torrent of blame and disbelief, but I barely heard them. I was still standing in the aftershock of that gaze, of a man who had looked past the gilded cage and seen the bird. For the first time in my life, I had not been merely Alara. I had been seen. The Duke's visit set in motion a series of events that baffled my family and set the local society to frantic whispering. He returned 2 days later, not with a retinue, but alone, on horseback. He did not ask for my father, nor for Lavinia. He asked for me. He requested that I accompany him on a walk to inspect the disputed stream firsthand. My mother was apoplectic, but to refuse a duke was unthinkable. Under the thin guise of propriety, my sister Lavinia was sent along as a chaperone, a role she performed with a confused and sullen reluctance. The air that day was crisp, with the scent of autumn, of damp earth and decaying leaves. The Duke walked beside me, his long strides forcing me into a quicker pace than I was used to. Lavinia trailed behind us, her fashionable but impractical slippers ill-suited for the muddy path. For a long while, we walked in silence, a comfortable quiet that was a stark contrast to the strained atmosphere of my home. He seemed to be a man who did not fear silence, who did not feel the need to fill it with meaningless chatter. "You are quiet, Miss Fairchild," he said at last, his gaze on the path ahead. "I have been told it is one of my defining features, Your Grace," I replied, a hint of the dryness I usually reserved for my internal monologue escaping. He turned his head and I saw the barest ghost of a smile touch his lips. It transformed his severe face, softening the harsh lines for a fleeting moment. "It is not a failing. Most people speak only to hear themselves." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "You, I suspect, speak when you have something to say." We reached the stream, a burbling ribbon of silver water that marked the boundary between our neglected lands and his meticulously managed ones. He spoke of irrigation, of water rights, of the way the land should be cared for. He did not condescend or simplify. He spoke to me as an equal, as someone whose opinion he genuinely wished to hear. I found myself speaking of crop rotation, of the books on agriculture I had read in my father's dusty, disused study, ideas I had never dared to voice aloud. He listened. He truly listened, asking questions, his pale eyes alight with an intellectual fire that mirrored my own. Lavinia, bored and cold, finally declared she was returning to the house, leaving us blessedly alone. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, slanted ribbons of light through the trees, a chill wind picked up. I shivered, pulling my thin, woolen shawl tighter around my shoulders. It was a pathetic garment, worn and faded. The Duke noticed immediately. He stopped walking and looked at my shawl, a frown creasing his brow. He said nothing, but his silence was more potent than any comment. It was a silence of observation, of noting a lack. We turned back toward the house, the easy companionship of our conversation giving way to a more charged awareness. The next afternoon, a package arrived from the village. It was addressed to me. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a shawl of the finest, softest cashmere, the color of cream. There was no card, no indication of the sender, but I knew with a certainty that was absolute and terrifying. My mother assumed it was a mistake, meant for Lavinia. I said nothing. I folded the shawl and took it to my room, my heart pounding with a strange mix of gratitude and fear. Kindness from a man like that, I suspected, was never simple. It came with invisible invoices. I laid the shawl across my bed, the sheer luxury of it a stark contrast to my plain, cold room. It was a secret between us, a tangible piece of his attention. Our encounters continued, always under the thinnest of respectable veneers. He would call to consult a book in our dilapidated library, a collection my father had not touched in years, but which I knew intimately. He would find me there, and we would spend hours in the quiet, dusty air, the scent of old paper and leather surrounding us. We spoke of Virgil and Homer, of philosophy and history. It was in that library that he truly dismantled my defenses. He saw past the quiet, plain girl and saw the mind that burned within. One afternoon, we both reached for the same volume on a high shelf, a worn copy of Seneca. His fingers brushed against mine. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me. I snatched my hand back as if burned. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken things. He did not move away. He stood there, impossibly close, his height and presence overwhelming in the narrow aisle between the shelves. I could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of sandalwood and winter air that clung to his clothes. "Elara," he said, and my given name, spoken in his low voice, was both an intimacy and a shock. It felt as if a wall had crumbled. I find I am weary of the title. My name is Alistair. My breath hitched. To grant such a privilege was a declaration. It was a step across a line that society had drawn in stone. "Alistair," I whispered, testing the name. It felt momentous, a word of immense weight and terrifying possibility. In that dusty library, surrounded by the silent witnesses of 1,000 books, the world shifted. He was no longer just the Duke of Blackwood, a remote and powerful figure. He was Alistair. And I was no longer merely Elara. I was the woman he was choosing to see. The thought was so profound, so utterly life-altering, that it frightened me more than anything had before. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom in the quiet corners of my heart was brutally torn out by the roots a week later. It arrived in a long, cream-colored envelope delivered by a clerk from my father's solicitor in town. I found it on the hall table, my father's name scrawled across the front. He was out for the day, and my mother was lying down with a headache, brought on by her mounting frustration with the Duke's continued, inexplicable preference for me. Thinking it might be important, I took it to the study. My father often misplaced such things. The seal was already broken, perhaps by the clerk ensuring its delivery. As I placed it on his desk, a second, folded sheet slipped out. My eyes caught a name on the page. The Blackwood Estate. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over me. I told myself to leave it, to walk away. It was not my business. But I could not. My hand trembled as I unfolded the paper. It was a summary of accounts, a long, terrifying column of figures. It detailed a series of loans my father had taken out over the past decade, using our land, our home, our very existence as collateral. The final sum was staggering, an amount we could never hope to repay. And the creditor, the man who now owned my family's future, was Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. I sank into my father's chair, the paper crinkling in my fist. The room seemed to tilt, the dusty air growing thick and hard to breathe. Every moment we had shared, every kindness, every conversation was instantly, horribly recontextualized. His attention was not a miracle. It was an inspection. His walks to our boundary stream were not for my company, but to survey his asset. The books, the talks of philosophy, were they all part of some elaborate, cruel charade? A way to assess the character of the family he was about to ruin, or worse, to choose which daughter would be the most pliable offering in a desperate bargain. The beautiful cashmere shawl, which I had taken to wearing even in my room for its secret comfort, suddenly felt like a brand. It was not a gift. It was a down payment. The kindness I had feared came with an invoice, now had a price, written in stark, black ink. I felt a fool, a naive, bookish fool who had mistaken a predator's calculated interest for genuine affection. The shame was a physical sickness rising in my throat. He called that afternoon. I heard the crunch of his horse's hooves on the gravel drive from the study window. My first instinct was to hide, to flee, but the girl who had hidden in the shadows of the drawing room was gone, burned away by the acid of this betrayal. What stood in her place was a woman forged in fury and heartbreak. I walked out of the study, the damning letter clutched in my hand, and met him in the hall. He smiled when he saw me, the rare, gentle expression that I had come to treasure. "Alara, I was hoping I might find you." The sight of that smile, once a source of such profound joy, was now a fresh twist of the knife. I did not return it. I held up the letter, my hand shaking with a rage that was slow and deep and shaking. "Was this what you were hoping to find, Your Grace?" I asked, my voice cold and unfamiliar to my own ears. The smile vanished from his face. His eyes, those pale winter skies, clouded over as he recognized the solicitor's stationery. He looked from the letter to my face, and he saw the accusation there, the utter devastation. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Alara," he began, his voice low. "Do not," I cut him off, the word a shard of ice. "Do not use my name. You have no right." I shoved the letter into his hand. "Did you enjoy your little game? Assessing the holdings, both land and daughters, before calling in the debt? Was I a pleasant diversion? An amusing specimen to study before you brought the hammer down?" He looked down at the paper, his face a mask of stone, then back at me. The pain in his expression was so raw, so genuine, that it almost broke through my anger. Almost. "It is not what you think," he said, his voice strained. "Is it not?" I challenged, my voice rising. "Is this not my father's debt? Is it not your name as the creditor? Are you not the man who holds the deed to our home, our lives, in your hand? Every word you have spoken to me has been a lie, a beautifully crafted, cruel lie." "The debt is real," he admitted, and the words struck me like a physical blow. "I learned of it when my father's estate passed to me. It was a matter handled by my solicitors. But my interest in you, Alara, my interest in you had nothing to do with this. It was the complication I never anticipated. It was the catastrophe I did not plan for." "A catastrophe," I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "How very flattering. to be the wrench in the works of your financial arrangements. I turned away from him, unable to bear the sight of his face. Please leave, I whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of me, leaving only a vast, hollow emptiness. Leave me to my ruin. It will be more honest, at least. He did not leave. He took a step closer, and his voice was low, urgent, full of a desperate sincerity that I was terrified to believe. The interest in you was the only part that was not business. It was the only part that was real. But I could not hear him. The sound of my own heart breaking was too loud. I fled, running up the stairs to the cold solitude of my room, the place where I had always been a liability, the place where I now understood I truly belonged. He did not try to follow me. I listened from the top of the stairs as the front door closed with a quiet, final click. I waited for the sound of his horse, but it did not come. Instead, I heard his low, commanding voice speaking to the butler, and then the sound of my father's study door opening and closing. He was not leaving. He was waiting. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair through me. There was to be no clean break, no simple end. He was going to force this confrontation to its conclusion. An hour passed. Then 2. The house was unnaturally quiet. Finally, I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy. Not his. It was my father. He knocked softly on my door. Ilara, may I come in? I opened the door to find him looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. The Duke is waiting for you in the library, he said, his voice heavy with a shame I had never heard from him before. He has explained things. You should hear him out. He would not meet my eyes. He pushed the papers into my hands. He brought these from his solicitor. They are dated from over a month ago, before he ever spoke a word to you. My hands trembled as I took them. They were legal documents, formal and stamped. They were instructions from the Duke of Blackwood to his man of business. The instructions laid out a plan to restructure my father's debt, to forgive a significant portion of the principal, and to extend the terms of repayment over 30 years at a nominal rate of interest. It was an act of profound, almost unbelievable charity. And my father was right. The date on the document was from the week before the Duke had first called at our house. It was before he had ever looked at me, before he had asked who was behind my mother. The anger that had sustained me collapsed, leaving behind a dizzying void. It was not a lie. His kindness was not a calculation. It was his character. The knowledge was a painful, staggering relief. I had accused him unjustly, thrown his own decency back in his face. Clasping the papers, I walked down the stairs, each step a reckoning. He was standing by the window in the library, staring out at the fading light. He looked tired, the severe lines of his face etched with strain. He turned as I entered, his pale eyes searching my face. I could not speak. I simply held out the papers he had given my father. You see, he said, his voice quiet. The debt was a problem to be managed, a duty, nothing more. He took a step toward me. You were something else entirely. You were the light finding its way through a crack in a sealed room. I have lived in shades of gray for 5 years, Ilara. A world of duty and memory and nothing more. I performed my role. I managed my fortune. I existed. I did not live. He stopped before me, his gaze so intense it was almost a physical touch. And then I saw you, standing in the shadows, with a book in your hand and a universe in your eyes. And for the first time since my wife, for the first time in an eternity, I felt something other than grief. I felt curiosity. And then I spoke to you, and I felt admiration. And then I spent time with you, and I felt a hope I had long believed was dead. His voice grew thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. You accused me of crafting a lie, but the truth is, you have unmade me. You have dismantled every wall I built around my heart. I did not seek you out because of this wretched debt. I sought you out because I could not do otherwise. You are in my every thought. The catastrophe was not the debt. The catastrophe was falling in love with you when I had sworn I would never feel anything again. The vulnerable confession hung in the air between us, raw and beautiful and terrifying. He loved me. The Duke of Blackwood, this formidable, grieving, honorable man, loved me. The liability, the plain, quiet girl. Tears I had refused to shed now tracked silently down my cheeks. Alistair, I whispered, the name a prayer. I reached out and laid my hand on his arm, over the fine black wool of his coat. The papers fluttered from my other hand to the floor, forgotten. I thought no one would ever see me. I see you, he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. He covered my hand with his own, his grip firm and warm. It is all I have been able to do since the moment I first laid eyes on you. The acceptance of his truth and the quiet admission of my own burgeoning feelings forged a new reality in that dusty room. We were no longer a duke and a debtor's daughter. We were Alistair and Alara, two solitary souls who had found in each other an unexpected sanctuary. Our alliance was sealed, not against the financial ruin that threatened my family, but against the lonely worlds we had both inhabited. The news of our unofficial understanding rippled through the county with the speed of a grass fire. My mother was caught between triumph and fury. She had snared a duke for the family, but it was the wrong daughter. Her ambition, however, was a remarkably flexible thing. She began planning, her conversation filled with talk of wedding gowns and guest lists, all while shooting me looks of simmering resentment. She could not comprehend his choice, and so she decided it must be the result of my cunning manipulation. The stage for her final, desperate gambit was the annual autumn ball at Westfall Park, the grandest social event of the season. It was to be our first public appearance as a couple. Alistair's presence alone would have caused a stir. His presence with me on his arm was a spectacle. As I descended the stairs that evening, Alistair waiting at the bottom, I saw a flicker of something in my mother's eyes, a last-ditch, dangerous resolve. I wore a simple gown of deep forest green, a color he had once said reminded him of the woods on his estate in summer. Around my shoulders was the cashmere shawl, a silent testament to the journey we had taken. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, a sea of glittering jewels and brittle smiles. The moment we entered, a hush fell, followed by a wave of frantic whispering. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, dissecting, judging, questioning. But Alistair's hand was a firm, warm presence on my arm, an anchor in the swirling tide of society. He looked only at me, his pale eyes a shield against the world. We had been there for perhaps an hour, enduring the endless parade of introductions and veiled questions, when my mother made her move. She approached us, her face a mask of strained maternal concern. Lavinia trailed behind her, looking pale and miserable. My mother's rival for the county's social throne, Lady Danbury, was conveniently nearby, her ears practically twitching. "Your Grace," my mother began, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those around us. "A word, if I may. As a mother, I must speak. I fear you have been misled." Alistair's expression did not change, but I felt his arm tense beneath my hand. "I am not aware of being misled in any way, madam," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Oh, but you have been," she insisted, her voice